At 0641 hours, early July 1944, the hedgerow sector south of Saint-Lô breathed damp earth and cordite into the morning air as a solitary panther eased its angular hull forward through a broken gap in the foliage. The sound of its engine carried low and deliberate, a mechanical throb measured and unhurried, as if the machine itself understood there was no urgency. It had reach, it had precision, it had time. Sergeant Harold Moretti watched through the periscope of his M4A1 Sherman as the German tank's turret traced a slow arc across the bocage. 31 years old, 7 months in the field, a voice trained to remain level, a hand that did not tremble. His crew waited in silence beneath him. Gunner Mason, loader Krieger, driver Valdez, coiled in the shallow belly of the tank, with drilled efficiency and quiet discipline. They were not speaking. There was nothing to say that doctrine had not already failed to solve. The Panther's main gun rested at 75 millimeters, long barrel, high muzzle velocity, flat trajectory. The Sherman's 75 millimeter gun was shorter, lower velocity, prone to deflection when fired against sloped armor. The Panther's frontal slope reduced effective penetration windows to near theoretical limits. At 2,000 yards, the Panther could fire and destroy with confidence. At 2,000 yards, the Sherman became a target and little else. The Sherman's ideal engagement distance sat below 500 yards, preferably closer, inside that narrow zone where geometry briefly shifted in the American favor. But every yard beyond that reduced probability of penetration. Each additional distance multiplied risk. At 1,000 yards, the Sherman's round became a hopeful insult. At 1,500, a demonstration of defiance rather than effect. By the middle weeks of the Normandy campaign, American armored forces in this sector had lost more than 100 tanks in frontal engagements against German heavy armor. Hulls burned, turrets split open, ammunition racks igniting like kindling. The pattern repeated with bureaucratic perfection. Sherman halts, gunfires, shell impacts, ricochet, Panther traverses, Panther fires. Sherman destroyed. Again. Moretti knew the template. Every tank commander did. It had been drilled into them inside manuals and briefing tents, spoken by officers with clean boots and theoretical confidence. Close the distance, fire on the move, use combined arms, flank when possible. But Normandy's terrain did not permit wide flanking. Hedgerows strangled mobility, mud reduced momentum, smoke betrayed approach, and Panthers held open sight lines like carved corridors. The battlefield dictated geometry. Geometry dictated outcome. In a direct confrontation from distance, the Panther ruled absolutely. The crew of Moretti's tank understood their disadvantage without conversation. Each man could recite the margins by instinct. The loader knew that his round would strike at an angle too severe to bite. The gunner knew that any second spent acquiring sight placed them deeper in the Panther's kill cone. The driver knew that armor thickness meant nothing if angle and velocity refused compromise. Doctrine told them to stand. Reality told them to die. Across the field, the Panther halted. Its engine dipped slightly, then steadied again. Its turret aligned with mechanical patience. Moretti could almost measure the seconds as its rangefinder settled. The German crew would be calculating distance, wind, angle, penetration probability. They had time for this. Panthers always had time when distance belonged to them. Moretti inhaled once and exhaled quietly. His radio remained untouched, his knuckles pale against the cupola rail. Behind him, the engine's idle carried a low vibration through the hull. The metallic scent of oil and warm steel formed a closed environment of readiness. No panic, no prayer, just arithmetic. The Panther fired first. The shell screamed over their position and detonated in the hedge behind them, throwing soil and leaves across the Sherman's glacis plate. The concussion rattled rivets but drew no alarm. A ranging shot. Correction incoming. Moretti gave no order to return fire. He watched. He recalculated. He let the Panther believe in its distant superiority just a moment longer. But the truth remained immutable. If the Sherman fired now, the round would glance away, shatter uselessly, surrender initiative. If they held position, the next shell would arrive inside their turret ring. A solution that defied both options had to exist, something outside the geometry of expectation. Moretti lowered his gaze for a fraction of a second to the worn panel of his tank's interior. Scratches, weld seams, residue of prior engagements. This machine had survived distances it should not have survived, because he refused to trust the rules written by men who did not climb inside steel coffins and advance into fields commanded by superior metallurgy. The Panther's gun recoiled again. Another shell tore into the hedgerow just left of their hull. They were adjusting, closing the equation, reducing their margin to 0. Moretti spoke once. His voice carried precision, not urgency. Hold. The Sherman did not fire. It did not retreat. It did not expose itself. It existed inside a fractional moment between survival and obsolescence, waiting for something the Panther could not anticipate. Distance had always been Germany's advantage. Distance had always defined American loss. But mathematics could shift. Angles could collapse. And somewhere inside the cold arithmetic of steel and velocity, Moretti believed proximity itself might rewrite the equation. Not recklessly, not bravely, but deliberately. The battlefield did not reward courage. It rewarded geometry. And geometry, Moretti realized, could be broken. As the Panther's turret continued its measured sweep, as its crew trusted in range and superiority and immutable physics, a question settled behind Moretti's eyes with quiet gravity. How do you defeat a tank that dominates you at every technical distance? He did not yet have the full answer, but he no longer believed the answer lived in distance itself. The Panther remained forward of the hedgerow, its silhouette sharp against the pale Normandy light, its commander trusting in distance as doctrine demanded. To the German eye, the American Sherman had frozen. Hesitation, fear, miscalculation. Every previous encounter had followed this same rhythm. The Sherman would fire, the round would fail, the Panther would answer, the engagement would end. But Sergeant Harold Moretti did not issue the expected command. Inside the turret, time stretched thin, not in emotion, but in calculation. Moretti studied the ground between them, the shallow depression that cut diagonally through the field, the low swell beneath a line of stunted thorn brush, the narrow gap where hedge roots slumped into soft loam, terrain that the Panther had not bothered to consider, because it did not need to. The range belonged to it. So it believed. Moretti had learned early that survival did not belong to the tank with the larger gun. It belonged to the crew that refused to behave predictably. "Driver," he said, voice even, measured. "Forward 2, slow." Valdez shifted the Sherman into low gear without acknowledgement. The engine note deepened slightly. Not aggressive, not hurried. A controlled crawl. The tracks began to turn, steel biting damp soil, compressing small stones, flattening tall grass. The Sherman moved forward at a pace so subtle that even the Panther did not react at first. Gunner Mason adjusted his sight, tracking the Panther's turret, but holding his fire. The loader kept his hands on the shell, knuckles white but unmoving. Moretti watched the German barrel, watched the moment it would recognize motion. At 800 yards, the Panther had no reason to fear them. It fired again. The round passed overhead, detonating half a hedgerow section behind their left flank. Correcting. Testing distance. Still assuming the Sherman would answer with compliance. It did not. Moretti signaled with 2 fingers. Maintain. The tank continued forward. 2 miles per hour. Then 1.5. The Sherman slid into the shallow depression, its hull roof briefly disappearing behind the natural crease in the land. The Panther commander could no longer see the full silhouette. Only the upper turret cupola remained visible, a partial target, a confusing geometry. The next German shell struck short, exploding in earth just ahead of the Sherman, spraying dirt against the glacis. The German gunner recalculated. Something had changed. At 600 yards, the Panther turret hesitated. Not in panic, in adjustment. Its commander leaned closer to his optics, re-evaluating approach distance. No Sherman advanced under direct sightline. They reversed. They flanked. They waited for infantry or artillery. They did not walk forward into superior guns. Except this one was still coming. Moretti knew the moment of discomfort had arrived. "Hold course," he said. The Sherman's nose rose slightly as it crested the shallow swell. The Panther fired again. The shell skimmed the edge of the hedgerow behind them and burst beyond. Range now compressed too quickly to correct with routine certainty. The Panther had built its kill profile around distance. That profile was collapsing. 500 yards. 400. The German tank realized the intruder had violated expectation. The turret snapped left slightly, then right, searching for optimal angle. That motion alone told Moretti everything he needed to know. The Panther crew was no longer operating on script, they were reacting. At 300 yards, the German shell came lower. It tore a chunk from the earth just to their right, kicking soil across the driver's hatch. The Panther had adjusted decrementally, but not fast enough to account for closing speed and altered perspective. Inside the Sherman, the air grew heavy with heat and metal. The loader wiped sweat from his brow without removing his hand from the shell. Gunner Mason adjusted his reticule, breathing slow and controlled. Moretti felt no surge of adrenaline. Only focus, only timing. 200, Valdez muttered. Moretti nodded. The Panther fired again. The shell struck a ridge just behind the Sherman and burst, scattering debris that rattled across their hull in a brief metallic storm. Too high. Too late. The window had narrowed beyond recovery. The German crew understood now. They elevated too fast, lowered too sharply. Their firing arc had been optimized for a compliant target that stayed where doctrine predicted. This Sherman did not. 100 yards. Moretti raised his hand. The Panther barrel adjusted frantically, attempting to regain equilibrium. Its commander attempted to bring the coaxial line into sloped certainty, but the geometry no longer favored computation. Moretti spoke. Up 5. Hold. The stabilizer whined softly as Mason adjusted. The Sherman continued creeping forward, now terrifyingly close by German standards. The Panther attempted one last correction, muzzle dipping just enough to compensate. It fired. The shell passed wide and detonated into the hedgerow just behind their right shoulder, close enough to shake the tank violently and coat the periscope glass in dust. But it did not hit. It could no longer recalibrate in time. The Panther had lost distance. With it, superiority. Moretti adjusted 2 fingers. Fire. The Sherman's 75mm cannon erupted, muzzle flash blazing inside the barrel sleeve. The recoil slammed backward through the turret, metal screaming briefly against restraint. The shell struck the Panther's side turret ring, at close to point-blank distance. Impact so sudden the German tank had no time to respond. Steel split. White smoke erupted. Internal fragments tore through confined space. The Panther lurched, halted, shuddered. Crew hatches burst open as blackened silhouettes scrambled free, abandoning a machine that had lost all authority in less than half a minute. The ambush had occurred not through power, but violation of expectation. Inside the Sherman, no one cheered. No declarations followed. Only the sound of cooling metal and controlled breathing. Moretti lowered his eyes once. Not in pride. Only confirmation. Distance had lied. Proximity had spoken truth. But beyond that isolated wreck, along the folded fields and hedgerows of Normandy, more Panthers waited. More would come. And this maneuver, more than instinct, was now proof. A refusal to play by range, a deliberate breach of distance, and the beginning of a doctrine whispered not in manuals, but between men who understood steel. The ground war had not yet adapted. But Harold Moretti already had. The Panther burned silently as its ammunition cooked inside the ruptured hull, a slow internal thunder that marked the end of one equation and the beginning of another. Smoke coiled upward through the shattered hedgerow, drifting over ground that had witnessed too many tanks die at respectful distances. Sergeant Harold Moretti did not watch the wreck. He watched the field beyond it, because this was never about one Panther. This was about what followed. The Sherman eased forward, tracks moving past twisted steel and scattered debris without ceremony. The crew shifted their eyes to the next ridgeline, the next tree line, the next shadow that might conceal an enemy gun barrel waiting to punish any tank bold enough to trespass into its zone. But they were no longer thinking in terms of distance, they were thinking in terms of intrusion. Moretti keyed the intercom once. "Range dominance breaks if they cannot measure it," he said, voice flat. "We deny them time." No one asked questions. There was no need to intellectualize what they had just witnessed. Tactical truth did not require applause, it required application. Behind them, another Sherman edged into view, followed by two more. Crews observed the smoking Panther in silence, absorbing the implications without commentary. One kill at point-blank range meant nothing in isolation, but it meant everything in pattern recognition. On the far side of the hedgerow, the ground shifted. A second Panther silhouette emerged, turret already forward, long barrel slicing air with deliberate authority. It had not yet identified the American tank that had destroyed its counterpart. It simply observed movement. Moretti did not halt. He did not fire. He did not withdraw. He repeated the same instruction. Forward. Slow. The second Panther did not immediately respond. It remained partially masked, watching what it believed to be an American hesitation. That pause lasted just long enough for Moretti to close further into its line of uncertainty. At 700 yards, he saw the turret begin to align. The Panther's optics locked. It fired. The shell struck low, erupting into dirt just ahead of the Sherman's forward glacis, scattering soil against the periscope glass in a raw spray of impact. The concussion rattled steel, but left no damage. The Panther expected immediate retaliation. It did not receive it. Instead, it saw movement. The American tank advancing, where doctrine insisted it would stop. Again, the German commander recalculated. Again, that calculation came too slowly. At 500 yards, Moretti angled slightly left, using the rise of ground to briefly mask his lower hull. The Panther shell that followed skimmed over the Sherman turret, exploding above in a brittle burst of smoke and shattered leaves. It had already lost its precise equation. 400, 300. Distance began to betray the Panther, whose design had been engineered to rule it. Inside the Sherman, Mason fine-tuned his optic alignment. The loader repositioned his grip. Valdez maintained deliberate speed. No shouting. No acceleration. The tank did not charge. It closed, closer than German gunnery expected. At 150 yards, the Panther adjusted rapidly, barrel dipping steeply to compensate for proximity. Its commander had crossed threshold from control to reaction. Its shot came heavy, fast, and imperfect. It passed behind the Sherman, detonating into the hedgerow with violent uproar that shook leaves loose like rain. The German gunner attempted to sight again, struggling against the compressed geometry that no training drill had adequately covered. Moretti seesaw adjusted one notch. Fire. The Sherman's shell struck the Panther just beneath its turret mantle, an area rarely tested because no standard engagement ever reached this proximity. The impact tore through thinner plating, rupturing critical internals. Black smoke poured immediately. Flames followed seconds later. The Panther halted mid-rotation. Crew hatches burst open. Another machine neutralized inside a range its designers never anticipated American armor would dare to approach. Behind Moretti's tank, the other Shermans observed and began replicating the motion. One tank advanced behind a tractor rut. Another slid along a shallow irrigation trench. Movement became quiet, deliberate, coordinated not in formal order, but shared comprehension. This was no longer desperation. It was tactic. More Panthers revealed themselves further down the field, spaced across the terrain with patient professionalism. But now, a structural shift had begun. Instead of stationary Shermans exchanging fire across hundreds of yards, tanks began to stalk. Advance, conceal, close. No ranging shot. No apology. No respect for distance that had always favored German dominance. German crews noticed. At first, they hesitated. Then they rushed corrections too aggressively. Then they fired too high or too low. Then they misjudged, and every time they misjudged, they lost. Through the morning and into the early hours of afternoon, reports filtered through the armoured columns. Panthers being destroyed at distances previously considered suicidal, Sherman crews closing inside effective safety margins and exploiting armour weaknesses never intended to withstand such intrusion. A whisper moved through the division. Closing distance. Point-blank ambush. Cowboy maneuver. The phrase carried half humour and half alarm, but it spread because it worked. Not through recklessness, through geometry, through timing, through the principle that breaking expectation was sometimes more lethal than superior firepower. In makeshift command points and shell-scarred orchard clusters, officers reviewed after-action reports with restrained disbelief. Panthers destroyed without flanking, without artillery, without air support. Just deliberate proximity. The numbers seemed implausible, until the wrecks confirmed them. By mid-afternoon, Sherman crews had altered their mindset completely. They no longer treated Panthers as untouchable ranged predators. They became targets of infiltration, of forced uncertainty, of pressure applied directly into the void where German optics failed to adjust quickly enough. But mastery of proximity was not instinctive for every commander. Some advanced too quickly. Some moved without terrain awareness. Some exposed themselves too early. And those tanks were destroyed with routine efficiency. The maneuver required discipline as much as defiance. It required mechanical precision from men conditioned to suppress that instinct. Moretti understood this better than anyone. This was not bravery. This was calculation. And if it were to save more than just his own crew, it would need refinement, repetition, explanation, because along the Normandy front, more Panthers waited behind ridgelines and orchards, their commanders still trusting in a distance that was already beginning to betray them. The question was no longer if the Panther could dominate at range. The question now was how many crews would realize that range itself was the betrayal before it killed them. By late afternoon, the fields beyond St. Lo no longer resembled a conventional armoured battlefield. The spacing between wrecks did not follow doctrine. Engagement points did not align with training maps. The geometry of destruction had shifted, and the officers attempting to chart it struggled to reconcile what their eyes confirmed with what their manuals denied. In the regimental command shelter, a tent reinforced with sandbags and anchored into the churned earth, Lieutenant Colonel Abrams studied a folded operations map marked in grease pencil. Red dots represented destroyed Shermans. Black triangles marked Panthers. The clustering meant nothing by conventional measurement. Distances between kills were too short. Angles too direct. Lines of engagement was illogical. Point blank, one captain repeated. They're letting them get inside point blank. Abrams did not respond immediately. He held a cigarette unlit between his fingers, the paper bending slightly as his grip tightened. He had read tank doctrine since commissioning. Engage at range. Maintain mobility. Maneuver flanks. Avoid frontal encounters with German heavy armour. Moretti's unit had broken all three instructions and emerged with fewer losses. How are they closing? Abrams asked. Terrain discipline, the captain replied. Slow creep, hedgerow masking, no warning fire. They make the Panther fire first, then walk into its range error. Abrams exhaled once, though he had not lit the cigarette. That's not doctrine, he said. No, sir, it's survival. Outside, a Sherman rattled past with scorched track plates and dust clinging to every surface. The crew did not look triumphant. They looked methodical. Like men who had recalculated their mortality. Across the hedgerow line, German communication reflected similar disruption. Panther commanders reported erratic American approach patterns, unexpected proximity, difficulty adjusting sights for sudden short-distance engagements. Officers demanded explanation that doctrine did not provide. Standard German range procedures assumed a target operating inside predictable thresholds. But American crews now existed in a threshold the Panthers had never trained for. Inside a shattered orchard, Moretti paused his tank near a slight embankment hull angled deliberately. He removed his headphones briefly, drawing air that tasted of soil and steel. His crew waited. He did not speak for several seconds. He simply observed the field ahead, tracing terrain advantages in sequence. Every fold of ground, every root cluster, every drainage trench. The landscape itself had become weapon. When his intercom clicked back on, his instruction remained clinical. Closing distance only works if discipline holds, speed kills, precision saves. Mason acknowledged without hesitation. Valdez adjusted posture against his controls. Krieger steadied the fresh round in his hands. No one romanticized what they were doing. It was risk, but refined risk. Another report crackled over the radio. Blue 3 destroyed Panther near Orchard North Grid, range under 100. Then another. Red 6 neutralized hostile, estimated engagement 70 yards. The numbers began to repeat. Under 200, under 100, unheard of, unwritten. Moretti said nothing, but his jaw tightened slightly. The trick was spreading, but a maneuver that spreads without structure fractures before it unshoe. He knew that not every crew would understand restraint. Some would attempt closeness without terrain. Others would advance in raw defiance. And those crews would become cautionary wrecks. And within hours, they did. 2 Shermans attempted direct advance across open ground at near 500 yards. The Panthers destroyed them before they reached corrective distance. Burned tanks reminded everyone that proximity was not recklessness. It was geometry executed with patience. Moretti tracked those reports carefully. He understood that the method now required explanation beyond instinct. If left unstructured, it would claim just as many lives as it saved. That evening, as the field cooled and mechanical echoes softened into distant gunfire, Moretti stood outside his tank for the first time in hours. The metal hull radiated latent heat. Faint scorch marks traced its side where debris had kissed steel. The air hummed with spent electricity and distant artillery. A captain approached him cautiously, boots crunching through brittle brush. "Sergeant," he said, voice low. "Command wants your assessment." Moretti nodded once, but did not immediately reply. "What you're doing out here," the captain added. "They're struggling to put it on paper." Moretti looked back toward the hedgerows, where 2 Panthers still smouldered, their turrets frozen in useless angles. "There's nothing to write," he answered. "We reduce their math." The captain hesitated. "You mean closing distance?" "I mean breaking expectation," Moretti replied. "They train to dominate 1,000 yards. We train to be where they are blind. And, if they adjust?" "They will," Moretti said evenly. "So we adjust again." The captain nodded slowly, but his eyes carried doubt masked by professional respect. Moretti returned to his vehicle and climbed back into the turret, settling once again into the tight geometry that had become controlled space rather than coffin. He closed the hatch above him. The sound sealed like a signature. Inside, the crew resumed readiness not because orders demanded it, but because the terrain ahead still held German armor that had not yet learned the lesson of intimacy. This new maneuver did not exist in manuals. It did not yet hold a name. It was not approved, not sanctioned, but it had begun shaping the battlefield, regardless of permission. And somewhere beyond the hedgerows, German commanders would begin to notice a pattern they could not explain. Shermans no longer feared distance. They weaponized closeness. The doctrine that refused to exist was already rewriting the field. And Harold Moretti knew the next engagement would not be about whether it could work again. It would be about whether the enemy learned how to break it. Night did not erase the consequences of the day's movement. It merely lowered visibility and sharpened silence. By the time darkness settled across the fields surrounding Saint-Lô, the Panthers that still remained operational had already shifted posture. Their crews no longer sat with full confidence in distance. They had received reports, burned hulls, abandoned machines, turrets split open at ranges no manual had ever prepared them to fear. German commanders were not slow men. They were methodical. They reviewed encounters. They revised assumptions, and now they understood something fundamental. The Americans were no longer obeying distance. Across the forward edge of the German armored line, Panther crews adjusted their deployment. Instead of holding extended firing lanes, they compressed arcs. Instead of holding optimum range, they increased defensive spacing and overlapping fire zones. Coaxial machine guns scanned hedgerow edges. Turret positions shifted more aggressively. Field infantry moved forward to detect creeping Shermans before they could intrude. Distance was no longer an advantage. It had become a liability. Inside his Sherman, Moretti sensed the change before formal confirmation arrived. The field felt different. The stillness did not carry the same predictability. There was tension in the air that had not existed earlier in the day. Not fear, but anticipation. He had broken first rhythm. The second was forming. Through the darkness, the soft metallic scrape of tank track shifted faintly somewhere beyond the hedges. German repositioning, calculated placement. At 0325 hours, the silence fractured. A Panther opened fire from beyond the immediate hedgerow line, its shell detonating just left of the Sherman's track with brutal proximity. Dirt slammed against their hull in suffocating waves. Turret alarms rattled briefly but settled. Valdez swore once, then stabilized. They were being baited. Moretti understood instantly. The Germans were testing whether this American tank would repeat forward creep or hesitate under surprise contact. They no longer trusted distance, and they had altered their pattern to provoke premature movement. "Hold," Moretti instructed calmly. Mason did not respond vocally. He adjusted optics and tracked shadows with precise patience. The Panther fired again. This time lower, closer. It was gunnery by pressure rather than accuracy, suppression to provoke error. Moretti leaned into his sight and traced the shimmer of motion beyond the hedge. He caught just the faintest suggestion of steel machine corner. One Panther. Possibly more. They were compressed now, working in coordination. He spoke again. Forward, controlled. Valdez guided the Sherman into deliberate movement, not rushing, not defying, just advancing with discipline. At each yard forward, the risk algorithm escalated, but so did confusion in the enemy's calculation. The Panther shell that followed passed slightly over their turret and burst behind with concussive force that shook the air thick with shrapnel hiss. German timing was tightening. Moretti did not accelerate. This difference mattered. If the Sherman rushed, the Panther would find a stable range solution. But by moving gradually, they stretched recalibration windows continuously. At 200 yards, the Panther's turret began oscillating more aggressively, its attempts at range compensation becoming frantic. This was no longer a predator dominating distance. This was a machine struggling to translate fear into math. Another shell struck ground near their right fender. Too narrow, too reactive. Their geometry had collapsed. "Steady," Moretti murmured. He watched for heat shimmer behind the hedgerow, then saw the faint outline of gun mantlet within tangled branches. The Sherman's hull dipped slightly as they crossed uneven soil. The stabilizer whined. Mason, adjusted by instinct alone. Fire. The muzzle flash cleaved the dark. The shell struck the Panther below its mantlet seam, punching into space the Germans had never considered vulnerable at such nearness. A burst of white vapor followed instantly by orange glow. The Panther staggered backward abruptly. Its turret ceased movement. Flames spread across its center mass, lighting the hedgerow like a brief sunrise. But this time, something different followed. A second Panther revealed itself offset to the right. It had been waiting. This was counter pattern. It did not fire immediately. It adjusted. It observed. It learned. This Panther did not seek distance. It sought perspective. Moretti's voice dropped half a degree lower. Rotation right. Keep forward motion. Valdez pivoted slowly. Mason slewed turret alignment toward the new contact. The German tank adjusted nearly simultaneously. For the first time, both commanders understood the new geometry. This was no longer distance domination. This was duel inside compressed air. The Panther fired, this time precise. Its shell struck the Sherman's left side skirt just beneath forced angle, tearing off track plating and causing lateral imbalance. The tank lurched violently. Valdez compensated immediately. Inside the turret, sparks cascaded across the interior wall. The impact had shaved margin down to milliseconds. Moretti did not speak loudly. Correct one. Mason repositioned 2 precise fractions of degree. The Sherman fired again. The shell struck the Panther side armor at just under 90 yards, where slope could no longer deflect inevitability. The impact cracked metal outward, rupturing internal hardware with punishing immediacy. The Panther failed backward and collapsed against its own track. Smoke and flame swallowed the machine. Silence followed, heavy and immediate, as if the field itself paused recognition. The Germans had adjusted, and still failed, because adaptation without initiative only delays collapse. Moretti held position momentarily, scanning through dust and drifting smoke for additional movement. There was none. No celebratory call. No relief exhalation. Only the understanding that German crews had begun to learn, and the learning curve would continue to steepen. The Cowboy trick had ceased being a novelty. It had become a measured threat, and each German response now edged closer toward reorganized defense, heavier infantry screening, overlapping fire matrices. Next phase was inevitable. It would not be about distance alone. It would be about who controlled the unseen mathematics of hesitation. And Harold Moretti knew the next engagement would test whether this maneuver was temporary surprise or permanent transformation. Dawn returned to the hedgerow sector with a light too clean for the terrain it revealed. Mist clung low over rutted soil and shattered trunks, blurring the edges of wreckage that now marked a new pattern of violence. The battlefield no longer carried the symmetry of distance. It carried the asymmetry of intrusion. German armor did not retreat. It reorganized. Overnight, Panther units had shifted again. Positions tightened. Fields of fire overlapped. Infantry squads advanced ahead of steel to disrupt any creeping silhouettes that had learned to deny careful range. Flares punctured the pre-dawn haze intermittently, throwing brief white curtains across the hedges to dissolve camouflage advantage before it could mature. Moretti watched this reconfiguration through his periscope with measured indifference. The enemy had not grown weaker. They had grown wary. And wariness, when disciplined, sharpened lethality. He tapped the intercom. "They're narrowing distance on their terms now," he said. "Expect close contact initiation." Valdez acknowledged. Mason rechecked traverse calibration. Krieger steadied loader rhythm without commentary. This was no longer about surprising Panthers into hesitation. It was about denying them control over the engagement envelope entirely. At 0516 hours, movement registered across the field's right flank, infantry screen. 3 figures advancing with deliberation, roles synchronized. 1 crouched, 1 carried forward optics. 1 held shaped charge system angled toward low ground. They were learning from the tanks. Moretti adjusted. Suppress forward hedge, coax only. The coaxial machine gun spoke in controlled bursts, cutting into earth and brush with calibrated purpose. The infantry forced themselves low and regrouped behind root cluster rather than advancing toward the Sherman's hull. Distance compressed unwillingly on both sides. Behind them, a Panther emerged partially concealed. Its commander did not waste time seeking 1,000-yard dominance. He had received instruction to engage early and close. He was adapting. The Panther fired almost immediately, shells screaming across less than 300 yards and detonating with violent certainty against dirt buildup along Sherman optics. Shockwaves rippled through the tank interior. Dust filtered through small seams like breath. "Hold," Moretti instructed. He did not maneuver away. He maneuvered directly into obscurity. Valdez advanced with precision measured in feet rather than yards. Mason tracked the Panther silhouette methodically as its gun barrel began micro-adjustments too precise to outrun indecision. The Panther repositioned slightly left, shifting angle to increase chance of deflection failure against Sherman frontal plating. It fired again. The shell tore explosive trench into ground just shy of true impact, saturating the space with violent particulate. They were no longer trading distance, they were compressing inevitability. At 120 yards, the Panther no longer held advantage. Its gun depression became awkward. Its turret traverse strained against closeness. Its commander had to confront a truth untrained in his psyche. The Sherman was not fleeing. It was entering. The Panther fired again. This time its shell struck the Sherman's mantlet edge and glanced downward, deflecting with a sharp metallic scream that vibrated throughout the interior. The impact would have killed another crew. This crew adjusted. Moretti's voice did not elevate. "Angle left. Fire on correction." Valdez rotated fractionally. Mason refined optic line. The Sherman fired. The shell struck the Panther below the turret ring, rupturing seam welding that had never endured penetration at such closeness. Steel burst outward. The Panther slumped into itself as internal ignition ensued. But this time, even as its turret froze, two more silhouettes shifted behind the hedgerow. German armor now arrived in pairs. They were no longer fighting singular threats. Moretti had broken their dominance, and now they had answered with multiplication. He remained calm. "Pair movement," he instructed. "Lead target only." The Sherman advanced again, not toward the nearest, but toward the one whose gun alignment revealed brittle hesitation. The second Panther fired. The shell exploded behind them. The third Panther waited just slightly longer, refining its range geometry. The Sherman's shell entered deep along left side plating, detonating internal systems with destructive efficiency. Flames followed. Smoke rose. The machine surrendered. The third Panther finally fired. Its shell tore into the Sherman's forward glacis and shattered, fragments slicing across steel interior like razor wind. Krieger ducked instinctively. Mason did not flinch. Moretti shifted posture gracefully. Traverse. The turret rotated. The Panther attempted backward movement must too late. At just under 80 yards, the Sherman delivered its final round. The shell struck the Panther's lower side plating and penetrated without deflection, blooming white into orange power that split the German tank's resolve into wreckage. 3 Panthers in under 6 minutes. The field fell quiet again, but not relieved, because adaptation had not ended. German infantry regrouped deeper into terrain. Panthers withdrew into repositioned firing clusters further back. They were preparing another equation. Moretti let silence remain for a moment before speaking. He did not celebrate. He evaluated. "They're resisting our pace now. That means we tighten ours." Valdez responded with a simple affirmative. Throughout the sector, reports echoed similar patterns. Panthers engaging closer, faster, supported by infantry. Shermans advancing with caution refined by method. A deadly choreography unfolding between unwilling participants. Not every Sherman survived. Some crews overcommitted. Some underestimated new German patterns. Some closed distance wrong. And those machines burned accordingly, reminders that geometry still punished miscalculation without mercy. By mid-morning, command observed a dangerous equilibrium forming. Germans had closed their range. Americans had closed their fear. The space between them had collapsed into lethal intimacy. This was no longer about who ruled distance. This was about who controlled hesitation. Moretti knew that soon German forces would introduce heavier countermeasures. Anti-armor teams, coordinated ambush, overlapping tracked fire. The battlefield was becoming more intelligent with every hour. And the cowboy trick, once a whisper of defiance, had become a doctrine still unspoken but undeniably present. The next chapter would determine whether it remained disruption or evolved into dominance. By late morning, the front line no longer belonged to maps. It belonged to behavior. Command channels crackled with overlapping reports that sounded incompatible until repetition forced coherence. Panthers destroyed at proximity. Shermans advancing without preliminary fire. German lines compressing. American crews refusing to engage at distance that had once defined their demise. What had begun as individual deviation was approaching structural pattern. In a forward observation post reinforced with timber and wired sandbags, Major Helen Carter studied after-action summaries with quiet disbelief. She did not question their authenticity. She questioned their compatibility with doctrine. A Sherman commander engaging at less than 100 yards, another at 70, another at 60, no flanking maneuver, no artillery support, no aerial coordination, just deliberate closure. She tapped the map with the blunt end of her pencil. "This is not how armored engagement is supposed to work," she murmured. Her adjutant shifted uncomfortably. "It's how it's surviving," he replied. She nodded slightly. That distinction carried consequence. Outside, a courier waited for formal instruction. Moretti's name had been underlined twice in the morning brief. Not for disciplinary review, for method inquiry. Major Carter folded the report, signaled the runner. "Bring Sergeant Moretti forward at first opportunity. I want direct explanation." On the field, Moretti did not know he was being summoned. He did not know that doctrine was beginning to tilt beneath him. He only knew that Panthers still existed ahead and distance remained unstable. His Sherman idled low behind a shallow ridge connected to an old irrigation runnel. Smoke thinned slowly. Heat still radiated through steel. He removed his hands from the turret grips for a moment, cracked his neck slightly, and reviewed terrain contours again. The silence was deceptive. Somewhere beyond his view, German commanders were working. Another adjustment. More smoke grenades ruptured faintly toward the eastern flank. Movement concentrated. Fire arcs repositioned. Moretti inhaled slowly. This phase was not about proving proximity. It was about formalizing it. He keyed the intercom. "Pattern remains. Do not accelerate. Do not halt. Move only when geometry collapses on their side." Valdez responded without hesitation. Ahead, an opening between hedgerows formed a corridor no tank could traverse without full exposure. It was a kill lane by doctrine, a measured corridor where Panther gunners could dominate with ease. Moretti advanced. The first Panther fired instantly as his hull breached the opening. The shell tore into left soil embankment, showering the track with rock and compressed grit. Instead of pulling back, he maintained pace. The Panther fired again. Its shell scraped steel and burst behind, explosive shock cracking through the rear fender structure. Moretti did not fire back. Not yet. He moved deeper into the lane. 50 yards. Then 40. The Panther's turret adjusted, but now oscillated with correction delay. At 25 yards, the Panther no longer held leverage. It opened fire again, point blank, but angle defeated accuracy. The shell fragmented on impact against Mantlet slope. Moretti fired. The Sherman's round entered between armor seams, shattering internal integrity in a breach, violent and definitive. The Panther slumped. The corridor went silent. This moment traveled far. By midday, accounts of Moretti's controlled engagements reached divisional command in uninterrupted sequence. Numbers stacked too stark to ignore. Panthers destroyed, Shermans surviving, distance inverted. A staff officer approached Major Carter with the newest page and simply placed it in front of her. She read. Then again. Then once more. "Get Moretti here," she said, no longer whispering. He arrived 30 minutes later, boots dusted, uniform spattered with dry flecks of soil and fuel. His posture carried no pride. His eyes carried no defiance, only clarity. Major Carter studied his profile briefly. "You are systematically closing on enemy armor," she said. "Against standing doctrine." "I am operating where enemy expectation collapses," he replied. She blinked once. "Explain." "The Panther holds dominance where it anticipates distance," he said. "If distance fails, its advantage collapses with it. We deny it time to correct. That is dangerous." "Yes." "And effective?" "Yes." "How many of your crew have you lost?" "None," Moretti answered. Silence filled the observation post. The adjutant shifted slightly. And how many Panthers have you destroyed today? Moretti paused half a second. 4, confirmed. Major Carter considered. You realize what happens when this spreads, she said. Yes. You realize others will fail attempting imitation? Yes. Then why continue? Moretti met her eyes directly. Because the alternative is predictable death. She studied his expression for signs of bravado. She found none. Just method. Show me, she said. He nodded once. Outside the post, he returned to his tank without ceremony. Within an hour, 3 additional Shermans executed the maneuver under his observation. He did not shout. He did not instruct through emotion. He moved his hand once. He indicated timing. They advanced. They destroyed. They survived. The pattern refined. By afternoon, Major Carter transmitted her recommendation to higher command. The message was restrained yet unequivocal. Emergent field maneuver observed. Proximity-based engagement disrupting German range dominance. Preliminary visual confirmation supports effectiveness. Recommend controlled dissemination. The language was bureaucratic. The consequence was structural. By sunset, new instructions filtered through selected companies. Avoid long engagement distances when terrain permits deliberate close approach. Commanders began adjusting forward posture. Not yet doctrine, but not dismissible either. The cowboy trick was no longer rumor. It was entering authorization. And for Harold Moretti, that change carried weight greater than his personal survival. Because maneuver that works only when understood, and the next stage would test whether acceptance could occur before the enemy revised again. The battlefield did not pause for doctrine to catch up. It demanded immediate precision, and distance, once sovereign, was becoming irrelevant. The morning did not arrive with clarity. It arrived with residue. Burnt hedgerow ash hung low over the fields like a permanent scar. Tank carcasses smouldered in asymmetrical alignment, twisted silhouettes of iron and shattered expectation. The earth had absorbed too much heat to release it quickly. Even the dew retreated. Somewhere beyond the tree line, German commanders were reviewing their own reports. Panther crews destroyed by frontal pressure. Engagement ranges collapsing. American tanks refusing to obey the predictable geography of fear. They did not yet understand the mechanism, but they understood the consequence. Harold Moretti's section advanced again before sunrise, engines suppressed, metal silhouettes merging with the dark vertical geometry of Normandy hedgerows. No one spoke. Communication passed through gesture and trajectory recognition. The field ahead had been a former orchard. Rows of broken root stumps created a maze of natural concealment. Moretti slowed his Sherman before the crest, scanning for presence markers. Exhaust vapor, silhouette disturbance, unnatural shadow. A panther emerged at the edge of the orchard, partially hull down behind a collapsed field barrier. It held position. It did not fire. It waited. Something had changed. Moretti observed carefully. This panther did not rush, did not reveal panic. Its commander had either learned or been briefed. Its turret moved in precise increments. Not searching, but calculating. Distance mattered to it still. But now it was uncertain. The Sherman moved forward at crawl speed, not accelerating, not withdrawing. The older behavior would have been hesitation. Now it was pressure without declaration. The panther fired. The shell passed wide, a deliberate miss, a ranging signal. Moretti smiled faintly. A mechanical habit, not emotional response. He understood. They were recalculating. He advanced 3 more yards. The panther reversed, not because it feared the tank, but because it feared proximity. This moment did not involve gunfire. It involved dominance reversal. The German tank began withdrawing behind the tree line. Its turret remained trained, but its confidence fractured. Moretti did not pursue recklessly. He followed deliberately. At 20 yards, the Panther attempted a desperate angular adjustment. Its reverse gear stuttered slightly on soft ground. The Sherman surged forward. A single round fired. Direct entry beneath mantlet seam. The Panther collapsed. This engagement did not last a minute. It lasted only comprehension. Word of this encounter moved quickly, not because of the kill, but because of the retreat. German tanks were no longer merely being destroyed, they were choosing distance. Behind American lines, analysts began reassessing projections. The Panther was still superior by metallurgical and ballistic metrics, but its behavioral advantage was deteriorating. The battlefield did not reward superiority. It rewarded timing and disruption. Moretti's trick had not reversed steel, it had reversed expectation. By midday, an informal directive circulated across forward armoured units. When feasible, compress engagement geometry. Deny Panther firing interval. The phrasing remained cautious. The implication was not. Soldiers interpreted it plainly. Get close. Break rhythm. Force error. The cowboy trick had entered collective consciousness. But what formed doctrine across divisions did not form quietly among the enemy. German radio intercepts recorded increased agitation from armoured coordination frequencies. Panther commanders demanded extended screening units. Infantry requested proximity suppression. Smoke veil formations increased. Confidence became structure. Structure became strain. And strain became exposure. By twilight, Moretti cleared another hedgerow corridor. The terrain had shifted from foliage to shattered stone and ditch lines. More tanks burned in ambiguous alignment. Both sides understood the engagement no longer followed predefined vectors. It followed psychology. His crew remained steady. Valdez rotated treads with calm precision. Lanza adjusted head angle without vocal cue. Ruiz loaded without questioning. Their silence was success. This was no longer an anomaly. This was operational behavior. Moretti recorded each distance, each hesitation, each delay in Panther response. These data points would be central to understanding the breakdown of range dominance, not because of destruction, but because of pressure. At divisional headquarters that evening, Major Carter read the compiled records for the fourth time. Her pen hovered above the page before she spoke. "This is no longer an improvisation," she said quietly. "This is evolution." Her commanding officer exhaled slowly. "And evolution spreads." "Yes," she replied, "or it dies improperly replicated." She signed the dispatch. Formal dissemination authorized. Proximity engagement technique to be documented and controlled. Emphasis on terrain exploitation and psychological tempo disruption. No name, no attachment, no celebration, just replacement of assumption. By nightfall, Moretti received no commendation, no acknowledgement, no ceremony. He received one phrase through indirect communication from command. Continue current operational geometry. Nothing more. He watched the horizon while engines cooled. He did not think of glory. He thought of distance, and how it no longer frightened him, because distance was now the weakness. The Panther still had every technical advantage on paper, longer range, heavier armor, superior optics, but paper did not reshape terrain, behavior did. And with every hedgerow crossed, every line shortened, every shell withheld until inevitability, the battlefield transformed. Steel was no longer measured in millimeters, it was measured in hesitation. The men who survived learned one truth unspoken. You did not destroy superiority through dominance, you destroyed it through proximity. And this new reality would not remain isolated for long. The cowboy trick had entered the bloodstream of armored warfare, not as myth, not as legend, but as mathematics rewritten in dirt and fire.